we have Professor Matthew Cheeseman and Dr. Paul Cowdell now speaking about Folklore Without Borders, which is an excellent project that I do recommend you look up and find out about.
Thanks, Dee Dee. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah.
Thanks, Dee Dee. Yeah, hi.
This is just amazing, Dee Dee. What an inspiring beginning, and I really feel really excited to be here. This is incredibly cool. It's great.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Paul, I can't see the room when the slides at all, so I can just see the slides basically.
Okay.
And I suppose this is a paper about kind of trying to capture the mood of the present with how folklore fits into that. Paul, do you want to talk through any of these definitions?
I mean, all right. Well, I mean, let's start with let's start at ground zero. What is folklore? Because that's kind of an important thing. If we're talking about inclusivity and talking about who gets to have folklore, who gets to do folklore, who gets to study it, it's just work out some assumptions. I mean, a few kind of basic concepts here. Folklore is vernacular expressive culture. Folklore or folkloristics is also the name of the academic discipline studying that that vernacular expressive culture. But in everyday usage, folklore sometimes comes also to be used for things which are not maybe necessarily inherently vernacular expressive culture. They're not necessarily things that community groups do for themselves, but they could be representations linked to industries, music, tourism, fashion industry. Folklore also has, like myth, a vernacular usage to mean something untrue. We don't use the latter, but we recognize that it's a real usage. So that's also something else that's thrown into the mix in all of the things that we're trying to address.
And I should say, I forgot to say, I think, Paul, Dee Dee, it's right that if you want to see the slides more, you can click on the slides and it actually becomes your screen, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, yeah. You did ask us, Dee Dee, to describe ourselves and our avatars as well, and forgot to do that. Sorry, we've just sort of plowed into this.
Although I am genuinely a scruffy, slouching git most of the time, so.
And my baseball cap was auto-generated. This was how I appeared in here, but I kind of like what's happened. So yeah, and the Folklore Without Borders project has this definition, has taken a lot from this definition. Folklore is a metacultural category used to mark certain genres and practices within modern society as being not modern. So certain things being not modern or being thought of as not modern within modern society. And as I'm sure many people here know, the word itself was coined in 1846 by Toms, and up till then, popular antiquities was used to sort of capture the same energy there. That it was coined in the 19th century tells us something. So this is sort of, this is actually a French image, but it's certainly an idealized image of a peasant, of a domestic rural worker. And of course, although this was from a little later, this is the kind of place that things are also happening. Modernity is in full swing. The city is a base stock of our countries, etc. On those evolutionary discourses, we've got a sort of basic use of folklore as a stage in culture. I don't know, Paul, whether you want to come in and comment on anything.
The evolutionary thing works in a couple of directions. One is there's this ascent upwards to the modern cultural levels with this residual primitive left inside it, which is a justification for colonialism quite often. At the same time, there's that nostalgia that Matt's talking about. You're looking back to this earlier period that was so much better than this current technologically advanced society with a decline of culture. So it's an incredibly complex set of negotiations around things that people just are doing, actually, you know, and I think we need constantly, particularly in terms of this question of inclusivity, is constantly to make sure that our folklore has folk in it. People do stuff. People narrate stuff. They sing stuff. They practice customs. They do it. It's not. We're not alienating the law from them.
Absolutely, and I don't know if you can see that on that slide there, it's probably two, but just exactly as you were saying, Paul, really the key to the emblems in the corner, going from savage, barbarous to half civilized, civilized and enlightened. So this is the way that England and the English have tended to position folklore. Or rather, these kind of four sensibility of loss, evolutionary discourses, romantic discourses, nationalist discourses are all kind of within it, but within England, perhaps there is something where the English tend to think of folklore as primitive or non-Christian, pagan, of the deep past, curious, weird, fixed, out of time, unusual, odd, uncivilized, still white, other within. And I'm not, you know, of course, this is heavy generalizing here, but there is, I think everyone will recognize some of these elements in some of the cultural structure of how we view folklore. Obviously disagree with lots of those. This idea, the survival of the primitive in the modern, was deeply popular in the 19th century, and it's a foundational concept of folklore studies, prioritizing semi-fictionalizing an idyllic rural white world, and at the same time elevating the elite status of those who are allowed to study it. And one of everyone, artists, practitioners, and scholars, we sort of have a duty to comprehend this legacy and how it might police folklore. And we've got to watch out for how it can dictate or want us to think that the sort of, yes, go on, Paul, sorry.
No, and what we're carrying unconsciously in our conceptions of it.
Yeah, how it forms our, I suppose, the ideology. Yes. And yeah, so being aware is it's our duty to think about what it might dictate. certainly this view of folklore, or this energy of folklore, has been really popular in the cultural industries in the 20th and the 21st century. There's obviously the Wicker Man. There's this folk horror, revival that continues to revive. These are all novels, films in the bottom right, canonical films that it draws from. Thinking of folk horror's popularity over the last, Paul, when would you say? 15 years, okay, perhaps? 10 years?
As an area of study, yes, but the phenomenon itself, it looks to the late 60s, early 70s as a form of expression, Witchfinder General, Blood on Satan's Claw, you know, the big markers, and then you've had this resurgence in the last 10 years. It's based on a lot of outdated, outmoded folkloristics, but very much with that idealizing of a rural pagan, mystical, rural pagan belief system that Matt's already outlined, those kind of earlier conceptions of folklore.
This survival of the primitive and the modern is absolutely at the center of folk horror. It turns it into a horror story, this primitiveness. So it's a sort of satirization of folklore in a way. So, question, what are 600 East London hipsters watching? There, this is a photo that I took last October. And most of these people in the audience were, I would say, in their 20s and 30s. I was there. I felt really old. I'm 48. I certainly felt old in terms of the crowd. And they're all focused, mostly white. Vast majority was white. It was definitely a very white crowd. What were they watching? Boss Morris, of course, amazing. In Dalston, in very fashionable area of London, and this was definitely, it felt quite interesting to me, having been involved in folklore for so long, to see such popularity going on in such kind of metropolitan kind of fun consumer event. So yeah, this was Boss Morris at Weird Walk's Samhain Ritual, 29th October last year in Dalston. And folklore's definitely having a moment. It's definitely cool. And part of our project is thinking why the left/liberals have turned to folklore, or young people. And I think perhaps Brexit is part of that, and folklore has become a way for people to think about our land and our place and a connection with the past without having to use the word nationalism. And I sort of suspect that a lot of the crowd here are kind of thinking about place and thinking about where they're from. And no one wants to think about English nationalism here, but everyone likes or well, is attracted to thinking about folklore. And surely that's something to do with Brexit, perhaps. And you know, so what? Is this scene, it's very white English scene, very liberal, very left scene, Stuart Lee was the compare. Is this just about UK English whiteness avoiding nationalism and exploring roots? And there's nothing wrong with that. But it raises kind of an uncomfortable question as well, because some of those earlier ideas we were talking about, so wherever or whoever folklore presents as primitive and white within maybe this context here is also framed as indigenous, I think. Or rather, that is what the far right may think. So the far right are also attracted to this English view of folklore, of something, and they might celebrate something dark and terrible in a bit of the way of that folk horror is. But the BNP is certainly did certainly evoke indigeneity, and indigenousness is being used here in a way that's totally at odds with how it's used in the global South due to particular history.
Yeah.
So,
and obviously,
yes, go on,
Andrew,
Paul. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, obviously, Andrew will be talking more towards some of these themes in the next presentation. But there's also that, that kind of invented, again, we're looking at that invented counter indigeneity, if you like. The fact that Boss Morris were at a Samhain ritual in East London.
Yeah.
It's kind of you get to pick and choose which bits of pagan origins you want.
And there's nothing wrong with this exploration of place and whiteness, perhaps, but there is some there's some worrying edges to it.
Who gets excluded?
Yes, who gets excluded? And certainly Folklore Without Borders is drawing on North American folkloristics, where, there we have hip hop, which obviously there's lots of connections with folklore and folklorists in the US. And there is generally in America more of I would say, a focus on evolving and contemporary culture in relation to folklore. Not this kind of folk horror doesn't really play out in North America. You couldn't really have Weird Walk or in North America because of the brutal legacy of colonialism. I don't think it would work at all there. And there's much more of a focus on the contemporary. And in North America and the global South, folklore has developed, this is the nationalism, it's developed as a radical means of community self-identification. So just in the same way that folklore contributed to romantic nationalism in the 19th century, that kind of energy throughout the 20th century and into the moment has in other places, I don't really think it is this in the UK, folklore is a radical means of community self-identification. And you've got some books thinking about that there. This is, of course, present in the UK, but I don't think it's at all dominant here. Paul, would you?
Yeah, I mean, where you've seen projects like, say, Folk Against Fascism, they've been to some extent more reactive than that proactive self-identification that Matt's talking about. Although that may be changing. Look at projects like Fayhield's Access Folk, for example, out of Sheffield, where I think that there's a very encouraging incorporative practice that is actually creating more of a community self-identification.
Okay, we've talked about that, and there's Zakia Sewell's work on Albion, which I think is an interesting looking into some of the issues that we've been talking about here from a mixed race perspective, thinking about deep England and what deep England, that appeal to the very ancient past, what that means from a perspective. Well. So very briefly, I suppose, Folklore Without Borders is these are some of the ideas that we've been thinking out as we have been working within this network, which Paul and I, it was funded last year with the cooperation of many people in this room. Thank you very much. And we've been seeking to think how to embed greater equality, diversity and inclusion within folklore and folkloristics. And I sort of worried that we're going to run out of time now, Dee Dee, but Paul, do you want to talk us through the 3 domains that that we have within the network, or our way of thinking about building the network?
Okay, I mean, we'll try and, because I know we are overrunning, but we try and wrap this up as quick as we can. But yeah, so we conceived of folklore, an interest in folklore across three domains. Obviously, there's an academic research domain to which Matt and I both belong, and that was who funded it. So that, however broadly we want to look, that did skew the work of last year. But we recognise that outside the academics, or alongside the academics, there's independent stakeholders, what we call the entrepreneurial domain, much to the amusement, bemusement, and disdain of some of the people who are involved in it, artists, practitioners, writers. There are also cultural industry sector, museums, galleries, archives, curators. Actually, in practice, it turns out that those 3 domains aren't kind of rigidly exclusive, and we each of us move between them.
Yeah,
I think that
so,
since the funding's ended, we're actually in a much better position to be able to proceed more equitably with incorporation across the domains than we perhaps were last year. But but it was certainly, the question was about one of the questions was how to break down the distinction between those groups of people, because those groups of people may not be, I mean, it's a Venn diagram rather than separate groups, but there are exclusions between the domains.
It's been very, very difficult to break down the academicness of us and the project. A lot harder than we thought it would be. That mitigating the academic power has been a real challenge. Yeah, and in terms of the challenges, terminology, diversity has been rejected by many people in our network, and it's a really problematic term with no other substitutes, obvious substitutes. And we've had a lot of concerns with language. We've had problems with or we've come up against intersectionality. Very hard when inequality is very diverse, and it happens in different ways according to how we identify as folklorists. You know, coming at it as a writer or an artist, coming out as a researcher, or someone who's speaking to the public. We've been thinking about how we can think about our history in the discipline and pick out an alternative, diverse history of folklore and folkloristics, something to counter the kind of, or not counter at all, but to challenge and make a problem the history presented today. So in the network, we've currently got 87 members. It's quite interesting. I mean, half are academics, a third are independent, and a quarter are cultural industries. 21 are members of the FLS, and about 60 people are kind of active. They attend meetings now and again.
That's the Folklore Society, just to clarify, the Folklore Society. I'm not sure that we mentioned that before.
Yes, sorry, yeah, absolutely. Majority identify as women. There are disabled voices, very few working class members, comparatively few gender diverse and sexually diverse voices, but there's certainly a real variety of positions of people in different stages of their career. And yes, it's mostly white. We've worked on several things. I'm sure you can have a copy of these slides if you're interested, and look at lots of documents we've been preparing that kind of capture some of what we've been talking about. And we've got 5 meetings coming up in 2025. We'd had one already, so there's 4 remaining. And I think Dee Dee is going to chair our next meeting, which is going to be amazing. And she's offered to do it in a much more achieving goals way than what we've done before. So if you haven't come along to a meeting, and you want to, just let Paul and myself know. And yeah, I think the next one will be very focused and different. So thanks. Paul? Yeah, thank you, everyone.